Beramings wys dat die inkomstediens dalk 50 miljard rand minder gaan insamel as wat hy aanvanklik gedink het. Vanwaar hierdie tekort? Hilary Joffe, senior redakteur van Business Day, is vanaand by my in die atelier. Hilary, welcome to the show. So, SARS expects 50 billion rand less to gain 50 billion less in this cycle than they budgeted in February. Why? Is this merely because of lower economic growth?
I don't think SARS would concede the point, to be honest. I think SARS is going to be fighting as hard as they can to try and meet their target. I think economists are starting to crunch the numbers and tax experts. And based on what we've seen so far, it looks like we're going to get a shortfall of 40 to 50 billion on February's number, which was already revised down. Now, a lot of that is just the economy absolutely crashing. And it's been a feature of the past few years where economic growth estimates have consistently underperformed what the National Treasury and the Minister have penciled into the budget. And we had that last year, and we've definitely had it this year, because if you go back to February, at that stage, the then Finance Minister, Pravin Gordhan, was still expecting the economy to grow by 1.3% this year. Now, we went into recession after that. Most people now think if we make 0.5%, we'll be doing quite well. Well, in fact, they're doing quite badly, but that's about as good as we can expect. And the next 2 years are also going to be much lower. Now, that translates directly through to lower tax collections. And particularly what the number crunchers now expect is that personal income tax collections particularly will fall short, VAT will fall short, showing just how under pressure consumers really are.
So what can a government do if there's suddenly a 50 billion rand hole in the budget? There are not too many options, right?
You know, it's revenue, spending and borrowing. Those are the options. Look, it is early days. It's possible, theoretically, that the economy could pick up and that SARS could pull out the stops and close that gap. But it looks pretty unlikely that that target is going to be made in this economy. And that raises the question of what does the Treasury and the Finance Minister, Malusi Gigaba, do going forward? Because they budget over a 3-year period, and the ratings agencies and investors look at them over a 3-year period. They can maybe fall short in 1 year, but they can't. They've been promising for years now that they're going to kind of slow down the accumulation of government debt. They're going to kind of consolidate. They're going to put the lid on this kind of ever-rising deficit. And they promise year after year, and clearly it's not happening.
So, Hilary, the temptation must be huge to add a wealth tax to the mix. This has been spoken about for a generation in this country. To milk the 1.8 million taxpayers who contribute almost 90% of personal income tax even more. Do you think there's appetite for that? And is there appetite for an increase in VAT?
Look, if you want real money, an increase in VAT is the only way to get it.
Politically, it's a
Politically, it's a nightmare, yes. I think that's been the worry. And of course, you know, you do have to look at whether it impacts on the poor, though, you know, the zero rating, you could give it back to the poor in some shape or form. But each 1 percentage point hike in the VAT rate would give the Treasury easily 20 billion. So you could close that back,
and the wealth tax?
Gap. The wealth tax, maybe 10 billion. In total, if all the wealth taxes together, because don't forget we've already got wealth taxes of one form or another, like estate duty, transfer duty on properties, at the local government level, rates and taxes. Based on international experience and our own sort of the estimates locally, which the Davis Tax Committee has been looking at, it's very unlikely, given how few wealthy people we have, that you could raise any sort of substantial amount of money. Doesn't mean you wouldn't do it for other reasons, symbolic and political reasons, but it's not a revenue quick fix.
Okay, so if they can't raise more money, then you have to either cut spending or borrow at the market. Let's quickly look at spending cuts. Politically, again, a very difficult thing to do, and yet there have been promises of that in the last few years. Were they ever kept?
They were. I think what South Africa has done since growth started to slide, which was sort of really 2011, 2012, where things really started to fall apart post-financial crisis, is to impose an expenditure ceiling. It doesn't mean that spending didn't grow. So we didn't have austerity like a lot of, say, European countries had. Spending kept growing, but much more slowly, and expenditure by government was capped. So if you wanted to fund a new project or hire some more people, you had to reallocate, and you had to do it within that ceiling. So we've avoided austerity. Now it's getting to the point where if you wanted to keep the deficit where it is, there would be no alternative to cutting spending. We've been hiking taxes. There's not much more we can do. We would have to really cut spending, unless we want the deficit to go up and the government borrowing to balloon.
Talking about borrowing, if we are fully junked by the ratings agency for local currency denominated debt, like Brazil was a few years back, the deficit becomes more expensive to fund, right? Because we have to go to international markets for that money. This can spiral out of control in the next generation.
Look, I very much fear that if really, really bad numbers are presented in October's budget, the ratings agencies could look to downgrade immediately. And it's not just the revenue side, it's also the expenditure side, because we've talked about sticking to the expenditure ceiling. But think about all the spending pressures that we know about. SAA, with the begging bowl out, and large amounts needed to save it. So that spending ceiling might be breached, and the revenue and the rating agencies look to downgrade. And we look at potentially junk status, which pushes up the cost of our borrowing.
How much of the mess we are in, Hilary, can be attributed to the political mess inside the income service, where Tom Moyane has been implicated also in being close to even the Gupta family?
Look, you don't know how much of the revenue problem is an economic problem and how much is what they call a tax administration problem. And in fact, indeed, how much is a tax morality problem. And they're all interlinked. I mean, obviously, in tough times, taxpayers are going to get more reluctant and they're going to look for any loophole. But I think what's happened in the revenue service was all these scandals in the last few years cannot have built trust in the revenue service or made taxpayers more likely to pay. And I think we may be running into a real problem with tax morality and taxpayers going back to their taxpayers going back to their bad old ways, where they look for any way of avoiding it. And why shouldn't they? Because look at the sort of powerful people in the land who are, taking money out, not paying their taxes, claiming, as the Guptas have done, to be earning 1 million rand a year.
Hilary, thank you so much for being here tonight.